Hey everyone, and welcome back to this explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on what has to be one of the most unbelievable rags to riches stories ever recorded in human history. We are stepping way back in time to explore what I like to call the crucible of comedy. We're talking about the intensely dramatic, genuinely heartbreaking, yet deeply fascinating early years of Charles Spencer Chaplin. We'll be relying directly on historical texts, biographies, and archives to uncover the true story of the Victorian childhood that literally forged a cinematic genius.
So let's just dive right into it with the ultimate question, right? How exactly does a boy with absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing, become the most famous man on Earth? How did someone born into utter obscurity somehow manage to capture the hearts of the entire globe? It's this stunning paradox, and to really wrap our heads around it, we have to completely strip away all that old Hollywood glamour and look at the brutal foundation of his life.
Because honestly, we have to shatter the illusion of his immense wealth. Picture the Hollywood conquistador, a man rubbing elbows with royalty, signing million-dollar contracts, literally dining off gold plates in his Beverly Hills mansion. Now contrast that with the London destitute. His everyday reality in the 1890s was grinding, inescapable poverty in the slums of Kennington and Walworth in South London. We're talking about a kid foraging for food and literally sleeping on the cold streets. The contrast is it's almost impossible to comprehend.
To truly grasp how that destitute little boy became a global icon, we really have to walk through the harsh realities of his youth. And as we transition into this foggy, sort of melancholic Victorian London setting, I want to quickly note that this video is for educational purposes and created under fair use principles. We're here to analyze the historical record and understand the making of an absolute legend.
You know, the entire foundation of Chaplin's childhood was just pure instability. As he later wrote in his own autobiography, I was hardly aware of a crisis because we lived in a continual crisis, and being a boy, I dismissed our troubles with gracious forgetfulness. Both of his parents, Charles Sr. and Hannah, were music hall entertainers, but their marriage broke down super early on. His dad was a severe alcoholic who provided virtually zero financial support, leaving his mom, Hannah, to struggle desperately, taking on occasional nursing or dressmaking just to keep her boys afloat.
Now, to really get what that crisis looked like, we have to talk about the brutal Victorian welfare system that 7-year-old Charlie was thrust into. Biographer Scott Eyman hits the nail on the head, defining the workhouse as a state-run orphanage for children whose parents were either dead or rendered insane, and they had no other adult supervision. Basically, when Hannah could no longer provide, the state just took over. And Chaplin remembered this period not just for the gnawing poverty, but for the absolute crushing humiliation of it all.
By 1896, the sheer weight of this poverty forced the family into the Lambeth Workhouse. Just imagine the trauma for a 7-year-old kid. He and his beloved older brother, Sidney, were ripped away from their mother. They were completely stripped of their identities, handed identical paupers' uniforms, and had their hair buzzed incredibly short. After that, they were shipped off to the Central London District School at Hanwell, which was this massive, imposing institution meant solely for destitute kids.
Looking back on it, Chaplin reflected, although at Hanwell we were well looked after, it was a sad existence, a forlorn existence. The emotional trauma there was just profound. There was this heavy sadness hanging in the air. The children were forced to walk two abreast down country lanes while the locals would just stop and stare at them. In fact, the school was notoriously called the booby hatch by those staring locals. It was a deeply stigmatizing slang term that made these kids painfully aware that they were at the absolute bottom rung of the social ladder.
And it's honestly staggering to see the sheer speed at which his family fractured. Let's look at the timeline. In 1896, they enter the Lambeth Workhouse. Just 2 years later, in 1898, his mother's health completely collapses and she's committed to Cane Hill Asylum. Fast forward to 1901, and his father is dead. Literally within a 5-year span, Charlie's entire support system is totally wiped out.
That downward spiral was especially dark when it came to his father. When Hannah was first institutionalized, Charlie and Sidney actually had to go live briefly with Charles Sr., and it was a miserable experience. By this point, his dad was severely alcoholic, and the boys had to tiptoe around his hostile mistress, who entirely resented them even being there. The conditions were so incredibly bad that it actually prompted a visit from Child Protection Services. Just 2 years later, Charles Sr. died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was only 37 years old. But for Charlie, without a doubt, the most devastating heartbreak of his childhood was losing his mother to mental illness. Hannah Chaplin developed severe psychosis. Historical records point to it being brought on by a terrible combination of extreme malnutrition and an infection of syphilis. She was committed to the Cane Hill Mental Asylum. As a young teenager, Charlie actually had the agonizing task of personally walking his mother to the infirmary during one of her severe relapses.
He later wrote about it, saying, "There was nothing we could do but accept poor mother's fate." The bond between Hannah and her sons was just incredibly deep and affectionate. Whenever she was well, Hannah did absolutely everything in her power for her boys. That made her permanent commitment to the asylum in 1905 all the more tragic for the brothers. At that point, they were truly, completely on their own.
So here's the crucial takeaway. How did Charlie respond to all of this? Well, he became what psychologists would call an invulnerable street child. He survived purely on his own wits. He endured long stretches of sleeping rough and foraging for scraps of food all by himself, while his brother was away at sea. He hustled, taking on menial jobs, selling flowers in local pubs, crafting toys out of used shoeboxes. And remarkably, he turned to the stage to survive, joining a clog dancing troupe called the 8 Lancashire Lads and touring English music halls before he was even 10 years old. But here's the really beautiful part. Even in her darkest moments, Hannah remained his most profound artistic influence. She gave him this incredible gift. Just to entertain him as a little boy, she'd sit at the window and expertly mimic the people walking by down on the street. Chaplin entirely credited her with teaching him the art of observation, how to express really complex emotions just using his face and hands. And above all, she instilled in him this unshakable feeling that he actually had genuine talent, even encouraging his very first amateur stage appearance when he was just 5 years old.
Amazingly, we can trace the origins of his most iconic character straight back to those gritty London streets, specifically to a destitute man named Rummy Binks. Charlie used to watch Rummy holding cab horses in Lambeth just for a penny tip. Rummy had this rheumatic body, a flat-footed shuffle, and he wore these massive, outsized trousers that looked like they belonged to a giant. Charlie was so fascinated by him that he went home and imitated the walk for his mom. Hannah found it so unbelievably funny that she had to stuff her apron into her mouth to stop laughing and then retreated to the pantry just to giggle for 10 straight minutes. Years later, those baggy trousers and that exact shuffling walk became the absolute global trademark of the little tramp.
Which brings us to a super fascinating question to think about. How much of the tramp was really just Charlie surviving? Scholars often point out that Chaplin's early films are packed with the familiar ghosts of his youth. You see the poverty, the hunger, unemployment, menial work, and this really profound loneliness. The tramp is the ultimate underdog, right? A homeless wanderer, constantly facing down cruel authorities and institutional welfare officers. People acting very much like the ones who separated Charlie from his mother. The tramp laughs at authority because Charlie had to learn the hard way that whatever promises society makes, you are essentially on your own.
So to bring it all together, it was this intense crucible of suffering that provided the deep emotional pathos making his comedy universally beloved. English Heritage put it perfectly, noting that Chaplin's genius was his ability to turn genuine hardship into genuine laughs. He wasn't just up there performing slapstick, he injected this deep, empathetic humanity into his characters because he knew exactly what it meant to be starving, abandoned, and completely overlooked by the world.
His life is this powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound art is forged in the absolute most difficult fires. And it really leaves us to wonder, if Charlie Chaplin hadn't endured the darkest, cruelest corners of Victorian London, would the world have ever met its brightest comedic star? That brings us to the end of our explainer on the childhood of Charlie Chaplin. Please do not forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel, Famous Lives Bio. Keep learning, and we'll see you next time.